We are going to be continuing with our adult Sunday school class, and we are in the book of Genesis. So with the last, actually since September, we've been going through the Gospel of Luke. We've been going essentially chapter by chapter, and last week on Palm Sunday, we had concluded with the final chapter about the resurrection. And now, today on Easter Sunday, we are back to the beginning. We're going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And so that's where we're going to be. So that's be easy for you to find in your Bibles. That is for sure. And why are we doing this book? Well, it's foundational. It's an important book. And I think it'll become increasingly clear as you go through the book why it is so important. And so let me just give a little bit of background on Genesis just before we dive right into the text. The pace that we're going to be going, usually with Old Testament books, we often do 2 chapters a week. It kind of depends. This week we'll be doing just chapter 1 and the first little bit of chapter 2, and there's a reason for why we're doing the first part of chapter 2. It'll be very obvious when you're reading it in the text. And then in subsequent weeks, probably 2 chapters, it depends. Some of the chapters are longer, and so in which case we'll go back to 1 chapter, but sometimes, especially when there's a theme that kind of matches, I will try to do 2 chapters, so 1 or 2 chapters per week, it depends. But this week it'll be just the first chapter. So as far as this, the book of Genesis here, and let me start with the initial question here of who wrote this book? Where does the book come from? Well, there's a pretty universal tradition in both Christianity and Judaism of ascribing authorship of the book of Genesis to Moses. And that was almost the universal opinion until the 19th century, until the 1800s. And I'll tell you why some of the opinion had shifted since then. But why was it commonly assumed that Moses is the author? Well, Moses certainly could have been the author. He was educated in Egypt, and obviously someone who's going to write a book like this would have to have a pretty high education level, and he would have been capable of writing this book. One of the claims that was made by critics in the past was that there's no evidence that writing had developed by that point. But we now know that, because we have writings from that time period, that writing had certainly been around. So he certainly could have written the book. And also, the books themselves seem to strongly indicate, we're talking about the first 5 books of the Bible, there's certainly strong indications within the books themselves that Moses is the author. Importantly, in the New Testament, Jesus himself refers to the first 5 books of the Bible as the books of Moses. And so Jesus, by referring to these books as the writings of Moses, as the books of Moses, is giving his affirmation to the belief that Moses is the author. Now, more critical scholars argue that actually there are multiple authors of Genesis and of the other 5 books of the Bible, and that the Pentateuch, or the Torah, they argue was only put together after the exile in Babylon, and it was the way that the Jews tried to make sense of things, and so the book actually has different authors throughout, and you can indicate, and usually this is called the documentary hypothesis, where you have authors J, E, P, and D, and this sort of has to do with which name of God they're using in which section, and that's supposed to be the clue as to who the author is. That being said, I hold to the traditional view that the evidence indicates that Moses is the author. Although I will say that with Genesis, it's more likely that he was an editor as opposed to writing the book from scratch. And there are some pretty strong indications within Genesis itself that where you'll see transitions where it's actually quite clearly noted, the key phrase, "these are the generations of," that's something we'll talk about next week, where it indicates that the author or editor is relying upon a previous written/oral tradition and is compiling it. So, but of course, if Moses is editing this book and putting it together, we would still ascribe overall authorship to him. It's just that he is relying upon other sources. So Genesis is important. It's foundational. It's in this book that we learn about creation. It's in Genesis that we learn about the fall. and that we learn about the need for redemption. If I could be so bold, without Genesis, the rest of the Bible doesn't make sense. Because why did Jesus come? Why did he die for our sins? Where did sin come from? You have to go to Genesis to find out. How does God work with the nation of Israel and with Jews? And so, well, you have to go to Genesis to find out. And it's interesting, when you go to the last book of the Bible in Revelation, just how it's, especially the last few chapters, it seems to parallel what we read in the first few chapters of Genesis. And so if you take the book of Genesis and you remove it from the Bible, you've just cut out the foundation. You've now made it impossible to sort of understand what the teachings of the Bible are ultimately based upon. And you'll see that again as we go through Genesis, just the number of times that in the New Testament, Genesis is referenced and built upon. Now, one other thing I will address before we get into the text, because one of the first things that people wonder about when the topic of Genesis comes up is, what position do we take on the creation-evolution issue? Because I'm sure there's some people going like, okay, I'm waiting for it here. What is his position on the first 11 chapters in particular? Are these more literal, historic chapters? Are they symbolic? What position? And then some people here might be sort of coming with, well, if he gives the wrong answer, then I'll just sort of tune out because he's obviously wrong about everything else. So let me tackle this one straight on. The question that arises here is, to what extent do we go to attempt to reconcile Genesis with the traditional scientific interpretation of how things began? What do we do with the claim of an ancient Earth, 4.6 billion years? What do we do with the theory of evolution, which states and is accepted by most scientists that all organisms have a common ancestor and have descended through a long period of time through processes such as mutations and natural selection all the way up to people today? Well, there are three main responses that Christian scholars typically give to this question, three broad categories of, so what do you do with that? The first is known as young Earth creationism. And this is the view that is held by organizations such as Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and plenty of others, who would say that the book of Genesis makes it clear that all organisms, all animals are created after their own kinds, and therefore rejects the theory of evolution, and would also hold to a relatively recent origin of the Earth and of the universe. Typically, 6,000 to 10,000 years is the number that's given. There are different varieties of young Earth creationism, but that is kind of the sort of the summary that encapsulates those different varieties. Second main option that is given by some Christian scholars is often called old Earth creationism. Some call it progressive creation. And essentially, this view says that accepts an ancient age of the Earth and of the universe, but rejects the biological theory of evolution, would hold to a literal Adam and Eve, similar to young Earth creationism, but accepts that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, the universe is 14 billion years old and such. Probably the best-known organization that holds to this view and promotes it is called Reasons to Believe, and is led by Dr. Hugh Ross. So if you've read any of Dr. Hugh Ross's stuff, that would be a pretty good example of old Earth creationism. Again, there are lots of biblical scholars and that hold to that perspective. So there's a lot of Bible commentators that take that framework. And then your third major option would be what's called theistic evolution. Some call it evolutionary creationism, which accepts both an ancient age of the Earth and the universe and also accepts the biological theory of evolution, and argues that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are not meant to be taken literally at all, or at least not very literally. There's some disagreement in this camp as to whether Adam and Eve were literal people. Some believe that there are, some say that they're not. But overall, the theistic evolution or evolutionary creation view says that that we should accept the standard scientific framework, and that we should also recognize that the text of the first 11 chapters is not meant to convey any scientific information. Rather, it's given in story form to convey to the ancient Israelites in language they can understand that God is the creator. If you've ever heard of Dr. Francis Collins, the organization BioLogos, that would be probably the best known website that holds that view. A couple of years ago, I actually taught a course at Steinbeck Bible College, specifically on this exact issue. It was called 3 Views on Creation Evolution, and what I did was we walked through the case for young Earth creationism and then a critique of it, and then the case for old Earth creationism and critiqued it, and then the case for theistic evolution and then provided a critique. And so that was a course that I taught a couple years ago at SBC, and then I did a shorter version of that a couple years ago at the Blumenart Community Church. They asked me to come into their adult Sunday school class and do that. And I will say, before I give my own opinion here, there are good Christians who will hold each of these viewpoints. We must be careful not to elevate this issue higher than what the Bible itself does. Your salvation is not in jeopardy if you hold the wrong view on this issue. And again, there's a fairly high possibility that you'll be wrong on this topic, because we can't all be right. And so if you hold one of these 3 views, if one of the other views happens to be correct, that makes you wrong. That makes you incorrect on this. And I don't think the issue is minor. I think that there are some important things that come out of the position you hold on this, but I also don't think that we should elevate it to the point that we're questioning someone's faith. So, for example, let me give you a couple illustrations here. Do you like C.S. Lewis? Do you like reading Mere Christianity and the Chronicles of Narnia and the Screwtape Letters? C.S. Lewis believed in evolution. He was a theistic evolutionist. So if you believe that everyone who holds theistic evolution, if all their writings are suspect, toss out all your C.S. Lewis materials. And if you doubt me on this, go read Mere Christianity. He actually has some sections where he talks about this. Benjamin Warfield, B.B. Warfield, one of the big scholars of biblical inerrancy in the late 1800s, early 1900s at Princeton Theological Seminary before it became more liberal, also held to a form of theistic evolution. And so just being aware of that. That being said, I believe that in terms of making the best sense of the biblical text, and this is a view I've held for some time. I had almost moved away from it a few years ago just because I really didn't like sort of arguing about this, or I was sort of going, maybe I'll just completely kind of set it aside and not worry about it at all. And then I did that SBC course where I had to re-engage with all the materials and all that, and it convinced me once again that no, this view is the best interpretation of the biblical text, even though I respect the position of other Christians on this. So, all that being said, what framework am I personally going to be using here? I'll be using the young Earth creationist viewpoint while I go through the biblical text. That's the default setting that I'm going to be using to explore, especially the first few chapters of Genesis. I will periodically reference how different viewpoints interpret some key passages. So I'm not going to present only one side throughout the whole thing here, but I can't do that consistently with every single thing. I just have to pick one and kind of use it as a default setting, and then kind of give some illustrations out from there. So if you happen to hold one of the other viewpoints, I am not casting your faith into question. I'm not claiming that you're wrong in every point. When I was a high school student, and just a bit of background on my involvement with this topic. In high school, I was obsessed with this topic, and obsessed doesn't even begin to describe it. When I was going into grade 10, I remember getting the book by Henry Morris, Scientific Creationism, and I devoured that, and I was like, I got to tell everyone about this. And I became obsessed with this topic. I had a paper route. I delivered papers for 4 years. You know what most of my paper route money went towards? Buying books on creation and evolution. And it wasn't just books promoting creationism. I bought evolution books. I have almost every book written by evolutionary scientists, Stephen Jay Gould, for example. I have most of Richard Dawkins' books. So I've got The Selfish Gene and The Blind Watchmaker and all of that. I read those in high school because I was just really, really interested in this topic. When I was in grade 10, I even challenged one of the biology teachers at the SRSS to a creation-evolution debate. During the lunch hour, a public debate, which we recorded. The teacher I was up against, you might know, J.D. Lees, a very, very, very good debater, and I told him, you don't go soft to me. He didn't go soft to me. So if you can imagine, 15 years old up against J.D. Lees, people told me I did okay, but I was 15, so I did the best that I could. And but anyway, I was obsessed with that topic. In high school, I probably bought like 100 books on the topic. I could prove it. I still have them. I've bought more since. But I've also become a bit more pragmatic on this issue. Even back then, even though I held, I preferred this view, the young Earth view, I also did recognize even back then that it's not like there's not challenges. There's some major challenges. And I spent a lot of time chatting with the librarian at the time, Mr. Bert Seuss, one of the wisest men that I've known as far as, calm, reasonable, saying, Michael, you might want to sort of consider this and, think this through here. No, I'm glad you're enthusiastic about this, but doing a lot to sort of temper my instincts to just go hard on everything. So all of that being said, that if you knew me back then, I apologize for being way too obsessed with this topic. And that's right, Mrs. Isaac, you were one of the librarians. So yes, you remember all of this. And I was just spent all this time in the library checking out all the books on creation evolution. So yes. So anyway, I was obsessed with the topic. So even though I'm going to be going with essentially the same framework that I would have held then, I really want to do it in a more balanced way because I was way too obsessed with it then. One of the things that I do find most convincing about this framework is that there is a very clear worldview that emerges from it, and it makes sense of the biblical narrative, in my view, better than the other two frameworks of the old Earth creationism and theistic evolution viewpoint. There are answers that the other sides give that are reasonable answers, but anyway, so that's just setting some context. I know that went a bit long before I got into the text, but just figured I'd share that because I know that the people here are sort of wondering, okay, so what framework is he going to use, and is it going to be the right one or the wrong one? If I picked the wrong one for you, I'm sorry. I will try to still keep it relevant throughout, but yeah, you can't really do this without just stating clearly up front which framework you're going to be using as your default setting. So I'll pause here for a moment. Comments or questions? Okay, so then if you have your Bibles, feel free to turn to the book of Genesis. It's at the beginning, and I'm going to read the first couple of verses here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So you'll notice here, this is where everything begins. It's a clear, definitive statement. Now, some Bible translations do translate the first section a little bit differently. So, for example, if you have the New Revised Standard Version, it says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And the reason that some versions will say that is that you can actually construct the grammar either way. You can construct it to say, in the beginning God created, or you can construct it to say, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. Why do most Bible translations typically go with, in the beginning God created? Well, it seems like a more natural way to begin, because when you go the other way, when God began to create, your immediate question is, okay, well, what before? Like when God, okay, so he began. Here it's, in the beginning, God created. And there is a sharp contrast between the Genesis creation account and other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. And one of the things that's notable is that every tradition, religious tradition, has a creation story. Some of them will have multiple creation stories. And when you compare Genesis with other creation accounts from that time, is that God precedes the creation and is not part of it. Typically in other creation accounts, you'll often see God or the gods emerging out of some sort of chaos, where there's some sort of storm that that the gods come out of and are bringing order to. If you read one of the Hindu creation accounts from the Vedas, and this one's called the Rig Veda. And actually, every year I have my students, we read the Rig Veda, their creation account, and I loosely call it a creation account because it actually doesn't really answer any questions. It actually says, it says something about, the gods came afterwards, like sort of after the things were already there. And then at the very end, it says, only he who is above the high heaven knows. Or maybe he does not know. That's literally what the Rig Veda says. And yet, when you read the Hebrew creation account here, there is no question that the universe did not exist prior to this point. Now, the Hebrew word, and I'll be referencing Hebrew here, and I do not guarantee about my pronunciations are being correct. I do try to find some of the phonetic things, some of the phonetic forms, so that way I can pronounce it somewhat correctly. But I don't know Hebrew. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so don't quote me on the Hebrew here. I'm just going with what scholars have said. The Hebrew word translated created here is bara, and it can mean creation ex nihilo, and ex nihilo means out of nothing. It can also mean fashioning. So bara can mean creating out of nothing. It can also mean fashioning something which is already there. The context seems to indicate that ex nihilo creation is what's indicated here, because God comes first, and then the heavens and the earth. So God created. Now, the word which is translated God, and because there's more than one word for God in the Hebrew Bible, the word used for God here is Elohim. So I'm pretty sure you've heard Elohim before. And Elohim is actually simply the Hebrew word for God. And Elohim is actually often a plural. So there's a plural form of Elohim. So Elohim can mean God, gods, Godhead, something along, those are all legitimate understandings of Elohim. But it's got the bara is being used in the singular sense here. And so some commentators point out that already here in the first couple of verses, you've got an implied plural nature of God. That even in the first chapter of Genesis, you can find hints of the Trinity. You don't find the Trinity explicitly taught in the Old Testament, but you can sort of infer that there is one God and only one God, but there's also a plural nature within God that isn't fully expounded upon. And so it's never made explicit in the Old Testament, but it is implied. So for example, where it says the Spirit of God, this is in verse 2, it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The Spirit of God, sometimes referred to as the Spirit of the Lord, is generally understood by Christians to be referencing the Holy Spirit. And so again, even here you see reference to the Holy Spirit. And I should say that Jesus is here too. And we know this because if you go to John verse 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word is with God, and the Word was God. So you've got God the Father present, creating. You have Jesus the Son, because it says in John chapter 1 later on, it says, that without him not anything was made that was made. And you have the Spirit of God. You have the Holy Spirit hovering over. Now, I should mention as well, one other theory that comes up, and this falls within an old earth creationist framework, is what's called the gap theory. And if you look at verse 1 and verse 2, the gap theory suggests that there's actually a long time period between verses 1 and 2. And that's because the phrase, the earth was without form and void, the Hebrew which is translated this can actually also be translated to read, became. So it is possible to translate it, the earth became without form and void. And if you have a trusty Schofield Reference Bible, I actually have one of those. I got one for Christmas. I put it on my list. And C.I. Schofield, it's a classic book, very, very popular in the early fundamentalist movement in the early 20th century. And in your Schofield Reference Bible, it specifically has footnotes there that explain all this and says that actually should be translated, the earth became ruined and empty. So the gap theory basically says that there's an initial creation in verse 1, and then some sort of catastrophe happens. Maybe that's when Satan falls out of, rebels against God, and there's a big catastrophe that impacts the earth too. And then, millions of years later, the creation, the rest of the creation happens. And so you get the long age of the earth and of the universe inserted right between verses 1 and 2. That is the gap theory. Again, it was very popular among conservative Christians in the early 20th century, largely because of that Schofield Reference Bible. Now, I will say that it has really fallen out of favor. The Christians who hold the old earth creationist viewpoint have moved much more towards the day-age theory. That's what Hugh Ross and the Reasons to Believe holds to. And so there aren't a lot of modern-day scholars that will promote the gap theory, but I mention it because there are some, who can make a case for it. I'm not convinced by that framework, largely because I think I have trouble inserting billions of years in between two verses when the verse doesn't really say anything about that. It just says God created the heavens and the earth, and then it, as most translators put it, the earth was without form and void. In other words, it had not been fashioned yet. So God has created things, and so the heavens and the earth. What does that mean? Well, it can be taken to mean only the earth and sky above it. That is a possible interpretation. And again, in the ancient Near Eastern worldview, if you refer to the heavens and the earth, often you could just be referencing, the sky and the earth. But I think it makes more sense to include the entire universe, mainly because later on, the sun and the moon and stars are directly referenced later, and we'll discuss that in just a couple minutes. But anyway, there's a lot to unpack in the first couple of verses here. But there you have it. Just the initial creation. Whatever viewpoint you have, though, you'll notice God's the creator. The universe didn't exist before. This is a profound rebuke to the ancient Near Eastern worldview that would have assumed that the gods sort of arose out of the chaos and such. Like, nope, there's one God and created everything, and everything is dependent upon God, not the other way around. So whatever view you have on the creation evolution issue doesn't change. God created everything and existed before everything. I'll pause there for a moment. Comments or questions? Yes?
Did God dictate to Moses what to write about creation? Or how do we get that first-hand account?
Yeah, the question, just because I know this is also being recorded, the question is, did God dictate this here to Moses? Like, how did Moses know, since he probably wasn't hanging around watching this? Yes, or he would have given him a vision. There would have had to be direct revelation here. There's no other way to explain it other than God directly revealed to Moses. But again, we know that this actually happens in terms of God revealing stuff to Moses, because when Moses is on Mount Sinai, God literally dictates stuff to him. The Ten Commandments as a prime example. And so I actually don't find it hard to believe at all that God directly revealed this information to Moses, because Moses talked to God face to face. So who better to be told and to write down the initial creation account? It's also possible that Moses is recording what had previously been dictated perhaps to Adam, and maybe there is a tradition that it carried down. That's also possible as well. But in whatever form, God ensured that the author or editor made sure that had accurate information. Because, there's no humans around. This one, you can't really explain this without God revealing it directly. Yes?
Yeah, I also kind of agree. It's nothing to be divided over. I mean, otherwise it would have been specified. But the beginning of verse 3, just the keyword then,
Yep.
God said, also suggest possibility of the gap theory as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and the question is just in reference, like where it says, then God said, could indicate like a time period in between. It's possible. Again, my problem with the gap theory is that you're assuming a lot. Like you're inserting a whole lot of time, like millions and millions of years, where the text really, there's no way that was really what Moses was intending to convey. That would be a bit of a stretch. But again, C.I. Schofield liked the gap theory, and he made it very popular, so yeah. I'll read the next few verses since it just continues on here. So verse 3, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there is evening, and there is morning, the first day. So we see here the absolute power of God conveyed in such simple words. He speaks, and things come into being. Each section of this chapter is introduced by God speaking, and God said. That's all it takes. God simply speaks, and things come into existence. And light is the first of God's creative works. And God speaks this light into existence. And it tells us that God saw that the light was good. Everything that God brings into existence is good. And then in verse 5, which we just read here, we see that the focus here is on how God has ordered time on a daily and weekly schedule. So you'll note, now you might be wondering, where it says here, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. We're might be going, well, okay, there was evening and there was morning. Why are we starting in the evening? Well, this was how the Jewish day was reckoned. The day started in the evening, and it continued until sunset the following day. That is why, for those who observe the Jewish Sabbath today, it starts with sunset on Friday evening and continues until sunset on Saturday. So the Jewish day actually starts in the evening, and there are other cultures that operated on this way as well. Now, the obvious question that comes up is, well, what is this light? There's a difference of opinion here among scholars about, was this pure light that God was the source of this light, or was this light the sun? And it's made clear later on that the light is from the sun, and that the sun sort of is made to appear. I'll get into that more in just a little bit, because again, there's some difference of opinion on that. But again, whatever viewpoint you have, God is light. God is light. God generates the light. And again, it's just, you'll notice just how much parallel there is between this chapter and John chapter 1. Where it talks about, for example, in verse 5, it says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so read Genesis 1, read John 1, verse 1, and you see how John chapter 1 doesn't make much sense without Genesis 1. You need Genesis 1 to understand John chapter 1. So we'll talk more about the light thing in just a little bit. Going on to verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now, we see that God, He's created water, and it says He's created an expanse in the midst of the waters. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern culture, in the other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts, water plays a crucial role in those creation stories. But it takes a very different role than what you're seeing in Genesis. So, for example, in Egypt, the creator god Ptah uses pre-existing waters to create the universe. So again, this is that thing about other creation accounts, is that there's always something that existed first, and then God does something with it or comes out of it. And so in the Egyptian story, God is using waters to then create the universe. In Mesopotamia, in the Babylonian account, it's out of the gods of watery chaos, that water ultimately comes. And the biblical creation account stands in stark contrast to this dark mythological polytheism. In the Bible, water at creation is not a deity. Water is not a god. Water is clearly not to be worshipped. It is something God has created. As light was separated from darkness, so waters are separated to form an expanse which God calls heaven. Now again, I will say here, and this is where some of the earlier versions of young earth creationism went way too far, and most modern day creationists will acknowledge this. So before you shoot me on this, look up the modern day creation stuff as opposed to Henry Morris of the 60s and 70s, okay? Some of the earlier creationists sort of got a whole theory called the canopy theory, saying that this expanse is referencing a big dense water vapor thing around the earth, and that when the flood happened, the water from there came down, and that's where many of the flood waters came from, and there was this temperate climate before the flood. They wrote entire sections of books, and there was even an entire book about this called The Waters Above. And the problem with the canopy theory is it doesn't scientifically make sense. It's actually been proven that you just that much water vapor is just, we'd be cooking the planet. And so, and again, if you doubt me on this, go to Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries International. They'll say the same thing. So if you're really big on the canopy theory, all the more power to you, but then stay in the 70s, because the modern day creationists don't hold to this. So we got to be careful not to read more into the text than what it says. I think here there's more of a, there's definitely a theological point here about God is supreme over water, just as he also created light. And we got to be careful not to read more into the text than what it actually says. Let me go on to verse 9 here. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And so you see two further regions are organized by God. You've got the dry land, and you have the waters forming seas, and God instructs the earth to bring forth vegetation. So you can see in these first 3 days of creation, it's focusing on the structure of the earth itself, along with vegetation, which of course then gets filled in. Now, going on to verse 14, and then I'll open up some comments and questions here. Verse 11, and then go on. And God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruits, trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind, on the earth." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So you see the vegetation has been created. And then day 4, it says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night." And it tells us the reason for them: signs and seasons, days and years. And you'll notice that at no point is the sun and the moon directly given the name, the sun and the moon. It just refers to the greater light and their lesser light. Why is that? Well, again, in ancient Near Eastern culture, the sun, and to a lesser degree the moon, were worshipped as deities. The sun god. And what Genesis is doing is taking the sun and demoting it. It's the greater light, and then you've got the lesser light. But there is no question here, it's not a deity. It's created by God, and it's created for a purpose. It's created by God to give us signs and seasons and for days and for years. And now, this is where some of the debate comes in about when exactly was the sun created. Well, you'll notice in the English translations, the more literal ones do kind of reflect this, including the ESV here. You'll notice it says in verse 14, it says, "And God said, 'Let there be lights.'" And so, "let there be" is another term for creation. It's the word haya, which literally means "let there be." This can mean that they previously existed, although it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just, so you've got bara, which more naturally goes along with creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And then you've got haya, which can mean either, it could still also refer to creating out of nothing, but it also can mean fashioning out of pre-existing or even revealing. So some scholars argue that this is, now we're in a earth level kind of human frame of reference, and if you look up, God kind of cleared the skies, and you could now see the sun and the moon and the stars, and that the sun had been the source of the light right from the beginning. That would be a very dominant view among both old Earth creationists and among theistic evolutionists. Most in the young Earth creationist camp would disagree with that, although there are some young Earth creationists who hold to a young Earth but an ancient universe, but I don't want to parse it down too much here. So again, you can have a legitimate debate on this here. I would suggest that if you go to Exodus, I won't go there right now just because of time, but again, if you know your 10 Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, where it says, in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and it kind of lumps all of it, everything within the 6 days, and that sort of, in my mind, would strongly imply that the sun and the moon, are within that, and we're not prior to these days. You notice how they're created for signs and seasons, and the stars are almost an afterthought. Some translations say he made the stars also. Mine has the little hyphen and then and the stars, almost like, oh yeah, and by the way, he created the stars. Now, back then, the stars were a big deal. I mean, they knew that there were thousands of stars in the sky, big significance in terms of the constellations and such. Nowadays, we understand those stars, like those are really big. And so for us now, when you think about King David and when he said, we look at the sun, the moon, and the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? He was in awe. We are now, should be really millions of times in awe compared to David, where, wow, the universe is billions of light years across. Those stars are bigger than our planet, and many of those stars are bigger than the sun, and there's billions and billions of them. We don't even know how many there are, and it's reduced to, oh yeah, he made those too. It's just so if there's any doubt about God's power, that kind of settles it there. God is the creator. He's God over the sun, the greater light, the lesser light, and even all those stars out there. Those billions and billions of stars that are way bigger than anything that we could possibly imagine. And so, again, just conveying to us God's power over creation. Pausing for a moment. Comments or questions? Yep.
I don't need to be facetious.
Yep.
But I'm wondering, do you have any theories as to what language was God speaking when he spoke the earth?
Yeah, the question is, what language was God speaking when he created everything? I believe it was Plaudich is the correct answer, right? So, but my honest answer is I have no idea. I mean, it's maybe the language of God, whatever that is, something that would go beyond any of ours. So, yeah. I mean, the text itself is originally written in Hebrew, but I can't really go any farther than that. Let me go to verse 20 here, and I will also touch on the obvious question of what about the length of the days? Because no, I didn't skip that. I'm aware that's a big deal. Going to verse 20. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens." So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. Now, after having previously described the creation of the waters and the expanse of the heavens, this section focuses on how they're filled in with appropriate creatures of different kinds. So, for example, in verse 21, it says God created the great sea creatures. The Hebrew word here is tannin. And in various contexts, sea creature can refer to large serpents. It's even used in reference to mythological dragons, crocodiles, whales, sharks. The important thing here to note is God's sovereign over them as well. Oh, he's sovereign over the seas. And the sea back then was considered the scary place. So in referencing the sea, so if you ever wonder in Revelation why you got the emphasis on there's no night, and it's sort of downgrading the sea and all that. There's no sea there. It's because there's no threatening thing in heaven. Anyway, God is sovereign over these as well. So what are these categories referenced here? I mean, this word kind, the word is bara, Baramin created, so min is kind, so Baramin created kinds. And so these are the categories of animals that were standard back then. So again, we've got to be careful. Don't expect more modern-day scientific precision. This isn't Linnaeus's taxonomic thing. So we got to be careful about sort of, using the categories here and going beyond what is actually what is in the text. That being said, there does seem to be a continual reference to a separation between different kinds, and that's why I keep saying they were created after their kind. This is one of the challenges if you hold to a version of the theistic evolution view, is you really have to get symbolic here, because again and again, it seems to be, the text is saying that each animal and each type of plant was created after its kind, and it seems to indicate that there's clear differences between these kinds. And so a general outline is provided. Going on to verse 24. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good." Now, it's an interesting way of categorizing animals, but these are the three broad categories that probably reflect the way that nomadic shepherds would experience them. In other words, you've got livestock, sort of the domesticated animals you'd be working with. You've got beasts, you've got creeping things, sort of like probably likely insects and lizards and whatever else. And then you've got beasts of the earth, sort of those, basically non-domesticated animals. And if you're sort of going there, boy, that's not very precise. It's not intended to be. It's writing to people in a worldview they would have had at the time. That one of the mistakes that a lot of young Earth creationists fall into is they try to get way too much scientific precision here, and you got to remember that the text here, it's written for us, but it's not written to us. It is written to be understood by the people of the time, and for us to be able to understand it as well if we are aware of the context. So just keeping that in mind. Going on to verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God who created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I've given every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So, on this question of, let me address the days question first of all, because again, you've got different viewpoints here about, are these literal 24-hour days, or could they be longer periods of time? I won't get into all the arguments because that would just sort of take us far beyond and such. The arguments for them being 24 hours are actually fairly hefty. I mean, you've got the fact that the days are numbered: day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. When you go through the Old Testament, every time you have numbered days, those are literal days. The reference to evening and morning, I mean, that's how you would describe a standard day. That's the standard Jewish way of understanding days. Again, when you look at the context, it seems to indicate that one day, and then the next day, and then the next day. And you run into some problems, some significant problems, if you try to make the order fit with sort of the geological framework. I mean, Hugh Ross does a heroic job at this, like when you go to Reasons to Believe and they sort of outline this, but he has to argue for overlapping days because, well, I mean, like it has birds being created before land animals, and that's obviously a problem. So again, this is where, you just have to, whatever view you hold, you're going to have some challenges there. But yeah, there are there are some differences of opinion among scholars on this, and yeah, I won't really dwell on that one, just pointing out that there is obviously some debate on that. On verse 26, you'll notice this reference here, let us make man in our own image. Now, who is this us here? It could mean that God is addressing members of his heavenly court, like he could be talking to the angels, or it could be an implicit Trinitarian reference, as in God is singular and plural at the same time. So God is talking to other members of the Trinity, because the members of the Trinity can speak to each other. We know that. You can argue either way on this, but there is a plural reference here. And the word man, is referenced in verse 26 and 27, is the Hebrew word Adam. And it's actually a generic term that means humanity, that means man. I mean, it includes women too. You'll see that in just a second. But it also becomes later on the proper name Adam. So yes, I hold Adam is a literal person, but his name also comes out of the generic word for human or man. What is made very clear is that humans are, as a species, are set apart from all other creatures. There's no question here. I mean, we are created in God's image. What does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean that we physically look like God. That's not because obviously God is not a man. He is not, but it likely includes characteristics that God has, such as morality, reason, language, our capacity for relationships, creativity. Those are things that are unique to human beings. And by the way, whether you are young earth, old earth, or theistic evolution, on this, the three viewpoints all come together and would have the same view about being created in God's image. So even though I would disagree with the theistic evolution view, you absolutely can hold that view and believe that humans are created in God's image, even if you believe that humans have evolved, because God can work with whatever, including something that came from something before God just worked through the process. That's not the view I hold, but I want to recognize the fact that you have some pretty good scholars who make that argument, who are very serious in their Christian faith. So I just being careful not to sort of read more into it than what it actually says. But regardless of what view you hold, humans are set apart. And verse 27 kind of makes it clear where it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So men and women are equally created in the image of God. It's kind of impressive, actually, that in the very first chapter, you have the equality between men and women. That was not the standard worldview in the ancient Near East at all. And yet here it is, men and women are both created in God's image. So yes, the word Adam, man, is used here. It's used in the gender-neutral sense. We know because it tells us right in the text that both men and women are created in God's image. What about where it says, be fruitful and multiply and subdue and all that? Well, God is giving a mandate to Adam, to humanity, and we are supposed to take control of the earth. Does that mean we're supposed to destroy the earth? No, but it's very clear that God likes it when we do things. He likes it when we build homes. He likes it when we construct things. He likes it when we hunt and when we fish and farm. These are good things. There is no command here of make sure you don't touch anything. Like, I made this really nice planet, don't mess with it. Leave it alone. Go live in the forest over here. So again, if you're kind of more in that way of thinking, that's fine. All the more power to you, but why are you in a building right now where we've subdued? But anyway, it's very clear that we are supposed to do things. In the modern day application of this, if you have any kind of job, whether it's in the home with your family or whether it's out there working, you are doing God's creation mandate because God has commanded us to subdue and have dominion. And whatever profession you have, that is a good thing. Timothy Keller puts this really well in his book, Every Good Endeavor, where he really expands upon the creation mandate. By the way, Timothy Keller, Theistic Evolutionist, still a very, very good book, though, in terms of how he explains this. Anyway, what about this thing here about I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth? Does this mean that humans and animals were all vegetarians prior to the flood? It seems to be implied in the text. I mean, it's repeated multiple times. I've given you every plant yielding fruit and all that. Obviously, if you hold either old earth creationism or theistic evolution, you're going to say no, that's not obvious, because obviously you would not hold that. Most young earth creationists would say that yes, this is saying that, although not all say that. Some say that actually, got to be careful here. The text it does say that we're given every green plant to eat. It doesn't explicitly say you can't eat anything else. So again, don't read more into it than what it says, but it does seem to be implied the focus here is on the vegetation. And verse 31, behold, everything was very good. So the humanity, us, God is pleased with his creation. It is very good. Let me read the first few verses here in chapter 2, and you'll see why I didn't stop quite at the end, because the chapter separation is put in the wrong spot. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so this is the summary now, where the heavens and the earth are finished after the 6 days, and the seventh day God finished his work and he rested. Did he rest because he was tired? Well, no. Any God that can create the entire universe and the stars also, and obviously doesn't need to rest. But he sets a pattern for our work week, and you see it explicitly stated in Genesis 20, verse 11, where it says, 6 days you're to labor and do all your work. The seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and they rested on the seventh day. So the reason that God rests here is to set a pattern for our work week. Fun fact for you, if you think about our time measurements, days, what are days based upon? It's the rotation of the earth, 24 hours. Months, what are months based on? The lunar cycle. What are years based on? How long it takes the earth to go around the sun. What is the week based on? Nothing. The week has got nothing to do with any astronomical phenomenon at all. There's literally nothing in the natural world that corresponds to a week, and yet we all do the week. It's because God set the pattern here. The only reason we do the 7-day week is because God set the pattern for us. There is no astronomical thing we can connect the week to. At least I've never heard of one. Now, in terms of the seventh day, there are some scholars who argue that because it doesn't say there was evening and there was morning, that they would argue that the seventh day is still continuing today. So, for example, when you go to Hebrews chapter 4, it says there remains that today a Sabbath rest. God is, the seventh day is continuing, and they would argue that, see, the seventh day isn't literal, so therefore the other 6 days aren't literal either. Personally, I think that's reading way more into it there. It doesn't have the concluding there's evening and there's morning, because it wasn't necessary. The week's done. And I think, and plus, if you're going to argue the evening and the morning being removed indicates that it's not literal, well, then you're kind of acknowledging it makes it fairly literal for the other 6 days. So you kind of have to pick a side here. Let me just suggest 2 points of application. I'll open up to comments or question. One thing that stands out here is that treat everyone with respect, every person. You know why? Because every person is created in the image of God. It tells us right here in Genesis, every human being, male or female, is created in the image of God, and that much is clear. Second, if you remember that if you believe in creation, if you accept Genesis 1, you can accept every other miracle in the Bible without a problem. So if you've ever sort of wrestled with, how did Jesus actually turn like the loaves and fish and make it enough to feed thousands of people? That one's tough, and maybe I need to explain that one away. Maybe that one's just symbolic. Let me just tell you that if you can go with Genesis 1, with God creating the universe, you can do all the other ones. So if you can accept this one, you might as well just accept the other ones, because this one's bigger. So, because if you're creating the universe, whether it's old or young or evolution or not, God still did it at the beginning, and that's a really big miracle. So if you can do that one, you can do the other ones. So that's my advice as far as don't spend a lot of time worrying about the other miracles if you can do this one. And if you don't accept this one, well, then we got a different problem. So let me open it up to comments or questions. Did I actually make it through Genesis 1 and no one has a question? Is everything actually resolved? Okay, well, I just see here that we're actually just coming up to 12, so I will have to close with prayer. Next week, we are in chapter 2, possibly chapter 3 as well. I have to sort of see how that, as I prepare that, whether that's going to be 1 or 2 chapters. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, just thank you that you are the creator. You created everything. It says in the beginning, God, you created the heavens and the earth. And Lord, that is just an absolutely astounding miracle. And I just ask that you would help us as we read your word, and that help us never to lose sight of just how amazing that is, and that you created us in your image, and that means that you care about each and every one of us. I ask that you be with us on this Easter Sunday, and bless us as we interact with others this week. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.